The assumption is that at this point, an apocalypse occurred, around 2100 BC. A very powerful earthquake. The continent in the middle of the Atlantic, Plato's Atlantis, sank. Gigantic tsunamis rose. In Central America, entire cities were swept by the waves in minutes. The whole of Egypt was brought down by this tremor, which caused the granite coverings to fall off of the Menkaure Pyramid. The Ipuwer Papyrus describes an apocalyptic landscape. All good things are gone. There is not one black fingernail left. The plague hit the whole country. There is blood everywhere. The river is blood. The country is without light. All over Earth, the remains collapsed, except the most massive. The whole planet was shaken. Ocean levels rose. Coastal towns were overwhelmed by the waters in a few days. Civilizations recovered slowly from this cataclysm. Thales of Miletus, Pythagoras, Plato, Solon, Archimedes, Hippocrates, and hundreds of others stayed for 15 or 20 years in Egypt, not like tourists on vacation, but to acquire knowledge in the land of light. They went home with a few crumbs of knowledge that they taught when they returned to Greece. Let us remember, the Egyptian priests fooled Herodotus concerning the construction of the pyramid with cranes. The Greeks extracted from the Egyptians some formulas on concrete manufacturing and some architectural bases to build their first temple. The architecture of the Temple of Djoser, built 2,400 years earlier, was faithfully copied by the Greeks. The Athena Temple, the Parthenon, and Erechtheion were made of limestone concrete. The marble was also cast and not cut. This process was copied later by the Romans. But that was not enough for them, because the Egyptian savants did not reveal much. It was becoming crucial for the Greeks to get their hands on Egypt. All united around Alexander of Macedonia, the Greeks left to invade Egypt. After Alexander defeated the Persians in Granicus, his primary objective was to invade. No, Egypt. For the Greeks, Alexander deserved his name, the Great. After his death, his best friend Ptolemy settled in Egypt as king and never again returned in Greece. It's as if the head of the village became the head of Silicon Valley overnight. Such were Greece and Egypt at that time. His children, his grandchildren, entire Ptolemaic dynasties reigned in Egypt. Certainly, the Greeks would not have chosen to settle in the Third World. The Romans took their turn at seizing this knowledge, built their cities and their empire. We hear about cement and Roman concrete, but before being Roman, this concrete was Egyptian. Hundreds of Roman temples were quickly erected all around the Mediterranean Sea. The construction of the Colosseum lasted 10 years. To the west, the Roman Forum was completed in 8 years. It would have taken at least 200 years to build them out of carved stones. We know how to recognize a poured stone thanks to the insertion of an object which has no place being there, as in the example of the Pyramid of Medum. Lugdunum, now known as Lyon, there is ancient theater built during the reign of Augustus. On this site we see granite, limestone, and andesite blocks. They are arranged in a precise way like in Cuzco and like in Egypt, where a sheet of paper could not be slipped between them. These are amalgamated ores and poured in geopolymer concrete. At the very back, we find stones of the building containing pieces of iron. They were incorporated while the concrete was still fresh. The Greeks used a similar technique. They incorporated an iron frame to reinforce the concrete. Here is Baalbek, whose immense stones caused so much ink to flow. These famous stones do not belong to distant ancient civilizations. The Baalbek stones are part of the temple. They were poured on site by the Romans, like the rest of the temple. They were neither cut nor moved. 600 meters below is the stone of the pregnant woman. Below and next to it are two other stones of the same size in limestone concrete. These are the foundation of a new temple in continuation of Baalbek, but this project was abandoned. It is the work of the Greco-Romans and not that of a civilization which disappeared 12,000 years ago. The entire Roman Empire was built of limestone concrete. The Egyptians' technique to melt granite remained secret to the general public. Like all the rest of the empire, Egypt was plundered in its turn. After the conquest of Egypt, many Egyptian obelisks were taken to Europe, mainly in Rome. Later, ignoring the significance of the stories carved on obelisks, they added their crosses. The tools to extract and grind the minerals were enhanced and performed better and better. The Order of the Knights Templar, called the Guardians of the Temple, was actually an order of concrete temple builders. They gave themselves over to the church after being massacred in 1312. Requests to make churches, theaters, cultural centers, buildings, public and private, continued to grow. The financial stakes were enormous. Many concrete construction companies were born all over Europe. They were called the Freemason in England, and in France the franc-maçon, the compagnon de devoir, and others the maître commensini. Over the centuries, they came together to form a single international body, the Freemasons. They enacted a sacred rule. The plans, the information, the archives of each building will be kept secret, hidden from the general public. They invented the legend of carving stone for the average person, common mortals. Extracting the minerals to make concrete became easier. The composition of the mixtures improved, and the limestone extraction process, grinding, lime manufacturing, was gradually industrialized. The Church, therefore the Vatican, placed orders to make basilicas and cathedrals, and the Freemasons built them out of concrete. Everyone wins. The Church propagated the legend of the carved stone made from the suffering and sweat of the faithful. Thousands of faithful Catholics carried by their immense faith who cut stones for the glory of the Holy Church. When we visit these monuments, we are both amazed but also doubtful, with a feeling that something is wrong. In fact, the builders did not suffer as much by cutting stones as you might imagine. They were not the faithful of the Church that built them, but rather specialized and organized teams, masters of architecture and concrete. The Freemasons poured concrete not only for the Church, but also for the kings, dukes, counts, for different kingdoms, big and small, and all kinds of buildings. The most important sponsor at the time was the Vatican. Another way to distinguish a cut stone from a cast stone is the imprint of tissue. Some masons used linen fabrics so that the concrete could be easily detached from the formwork mold. These imprints are found in all buildings. These marks are visible on the first row, that is to say, the first stones laid at the start of the construction. Sometimes they mixed shells in the concrete like the ancient Egyptians. Concrete flowed freely all over Europe and around the world. It is enough to observe the first foundations of the buildings to understand that there never were cut stones. Egyptian concrete was not only used for churches, but for all infrastructure. From 1700 to 1900, hundreds of cathedrals were built, thousands of bridges, public and private buildings in all European cities. The Basilica of Notre-Dame de Fouvrières in Lyon is an example of different mixtures. We find here all kinds of concrete. Even the granite is poured. Don't go looking. There is no document on its construction. The tourist book explicitly says that the basilica is made of pierre de taille. Pierre de taille, large stones. Pierre taillé, carved stones. A subtle difference in French leaves room for confusion. There is no photo showing the stones being transported or lifted. We are in the real estate and concrete era. But at the same time, it is important to uphold the myth of cut stone. Freemasons have kept this secret for hundreds of years. One last visit.
I heard that the Clermont-Ferrand Cathedral was built with cut black volcanic stone from the surrounding area. I went there. After a quick examination, I found that this stone had also been poured. I observed the first row. Fabric imprints. Everything was poured. I decided to stop looking for cut stone. There aren't any.
Certainly, the cathedral is undoubtedly built in stone, but they are artificial stones and not carved stones. This is the true story of the philosopher's stone, which we so often hear about. The human being replaces nature by effortlessly creating stones which express the complexity of chemistry and reveal universal dimensions, knowledge kept and discreetly transmitted. The use of sacred geometry in construction from Egyptian knowledge was preserved and transmitted in secret. Only a few initiated architects had the privilege of accessing it. Masons applied sacred architecture and Egyptian thought by integrating universal constants in all buildings. The architects of the cathedrals deployed the meter, pi, the golden ratio, and the royal cubit. If we take measurements in churches and cathedrals, we find these units everywhere. To conclude, the Freemasons were never stonemasons, but a body of builders, architects, chemists, and mathematicians who used concrete. This is not a coincidence. It is indeed the blueprint of the Amun-Re temple in Luxor, replicated with loyalty in the Louvre and the Tuileries garden in the heart of Paris.